Okay, so I really want to talk about anti-Zionism, and I want to talk about it as a vehicle for anti-Semitic persecution, but I think this needs to be explained at an individual level, as an archetype, as an anti-Zionist archetype, as well as at a collective level, and how these things combine to create the vehicle for modern anti-Semitic persecution. So first of all, let me just give some caveats. I'm not talking about people who are in any way involved in this conflict, because obviously people from both sides and people who have, a personal stake in the game are going to feel how they feel. So let's put that to the side. The other thing that I want to say is that I want to separate anti-Zionism as a concept from pro-Palestinianism. It is possible that a person can be pro-Palestine and genuinely want, peace, mutual sovereignty, but a person who is an anti-Zionist is a person who has entirely steeped their identity in the concept of destruction of an independent state. Okay, so that is the archetype that we're looking at when we're talking about an anti-Zionist. Now, from an individual level, I think the best way to understand anti-Zionism at an individual level is to take the two extreme archetypes of either side. So you talk about the extremists on the far right. Okay, so you're talking about Candace Owens, Dan Bilzerian, Jake Shields, these types of personalities, and then the extremists on the far left, which is just too many to count. But they have a lot in common. So let's start with somebody like Candace Owens, for example. Okay, so Candace Owens clearly has a deep antipathy towards the Jewish community. There's obviously a deep-rooted hatred there. Everything that she talks about is sort of guiding the listener to come to this conclusion that everything is the fault of Jews, right? So there's this deep hatred that's sort of buried in the shadow. And this is the common denominator in basically all forms of anti-Zionism, is that there's this deep hatred that is buried in the shadow that the person is unwilling to confront. Now, you take somebody like Candace Owens and her views, her persona. So you have the shadow in Carl Jung's analysis anyway. You have the shadow and you have the persona. The shadow is sort of what's hidden, what's buried, and the persona is the mask that's shown to the world. So with Candace Owens, you have this persona based in religiosity, okay? And then there are these perceptions from the perspective of her religious standpoint about what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, what is sin, what gets you to heaven, what gets you to hell. And so what happens is that in her shadow, she has this antipathy towards the Jewish community. But as part of her persona, being hateful is not conducive to her religiosity. So what does that create? That creates something called dissonance. Dissonance is in effect a conflict, an internal conflict where the individual cannot reconcile something that is true or they know to be true in the subconscious, but they believe is not true at a conscious level. So for example, someone like Candace Owens has this antipathy and hatred that is buried in her subconscious, in her shadow, but in her conscious mind, she knows that that type of hatred is not acceptable. It's not what Jesus would do. Jesus was himself Jewish. And that creates this dissonance. So what happens when people create this dissonance? What they should do at that moment is that they should be willing to confront their shadow. If they were willing to confront their shadow and look at their shadow and say, what's here? What is here? There's hatred here, there's envy here, there's shame here, there's all of these things here. They could reconcile, they could resolve that dissonance, they could resolve that comfort from the conflict by simply observing their shadow and seeing what's in it. But because many people cannot confront their shadow because they are afraid of what they're going to find there. This is typically found in a person who is quite fragile, because a person who's quite fragile, if they take a look at their shadow, if they find something bad, they may believe themselves to be an overall evil person. Whereas a healthy constitution can take a look at the shadow and say, well, there are some negative things in there, but that doesn't make me a bad person. I can work on this. I can be better. I can improve this. I can take a look at this hate and say that I don't want to be this person and I can work at it, right? So people who cannot confront their shadow, they'll be aware of this thing in their shadow, in the subconscious mind that knows that there's hatred there. And then there's this dissonance with the persona that says that I shouldn't have this hatred. So how does this individual reconcile the conflict? How do they reconcile the conflict? we already discussed the fact that they're not able to look at the shadow. So what they have to do is they have to engage in rationalization to assuage this conflict. So the rationalization process is the thing that says, I'm aware that there seems to be this feeling of hatred, this feeling of envy, this feeling of shame, whatever it is, okay? But I don't want to accept that. I don't want to look at my shadow and see that that's there. So what I'm going to do instead is rationalize that and say that that's not about hatred, that's not about shame, that's not about any of those things. This is just about XYZ, okay? It is just about humanity, okay? So there's a rationalization process that seeks to assuage the conflict and resolve the dissonance between the shadow and the persona. So that's an anti-Zionist on the far right. You're talking about sort of like a Candace Owens anti-Zionist archetype. Now you go to the far left and you talk about people who identify as anti-Zionists, yes, but overwhelmingly these are going to be people that are, anti-colonialists, anti-imperialists and all of these things, and overwhelmingly also people who have a background racially, ethnically, nationally, whatever, of a dark history of colonization and imperialism. So what you see with the far leftist archetype, which is interesting, is that what these people have buried in their shadow is shame. And the reason for this especially is because when you talk about this far leftist personality, this far leftist archetype, you are talking about people who are very conductive. They are people who are very much rooted more in collectivism than in individualism, which you're going to find further to the right. And this idea of collectivism, this idea of mutual responsibility for one another, breeds this feeling of, connection with the other. And so if a behavior is considered to be wrong, even at a collective level, there's an internalized individual shame. Now, again, a healthy constitution, a healthy personality can look at that shame, that internalized shame, and say, but this is not my shame. I don't own this shame. This doesn't belong to me. I didn't commit those acts. I'm not a colonizer. My great-great-great-great-grandfather might have been, okay? The people that came before me might have been. That was a different lifetime and that wasn't me. I have no responsibility for that, okay? But the reason that they cannot reconcile that shame is because they are constantly exposed to this culture that reinforces it. They are constantly exposed to this narrative of white colonizers, colonization, imperialism, and we all have to be collectively responsible for this history by loudly denouncing it now, otherwise we are the same colonizers, etc. Okay, so there's this culture, this milieu of moral responsibility that comes with the far left especially. And so what happens with these far leftist anti-Zionist archetypes is that they internalize this shame, but there's nothing to do with it because they can't escape it. They cannot escape being white. They can't not be American. They cannot not be European. And so because there's nowhere for this shame to go in the body, it can't be metabolized, it has to be projected. And so this is where this anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism really comes in, because you have a personality that has all of this shame, that has all of this internalized, unmetabolized shame, and it needs to be projected onto something. And so you get an opportunity here. The far leftist anti-Zionist gets an opportunity here to project all of that shame of colonialism and imperialism and all of these things onto Jews, onto Israelis, and say, it is you're the imperialist, you're the colonizer, not me. Why? Because once again, the fragile personality type is unwilling to confront their own shadow. If they were able to confront their own shadow, okay, again, what did we say? They would say, but this, I don't inherit any of this shame, this is not for me, which is true and correct. But they're afraid of their own shadow, and they're in this culture of shame. So the only place that this shame has to go, which cannot go inside, it's too painful, has to be projected. It's projected onto the Israeli. So now that the thing that they hate about themselves has been projected onto the Jew, onto the Israeli, then comes the attack. I have to attack this thing because what I really want to do is kill it in me, but I can't kill it in me, so I project it onto you and attack it, and then I believe that it's been destroyed within me. Okay, so this is how the narrative goes, that those who believe that they're fighting evil invariably end up being the evil that they're claiming to fight. Okay, I need to kill you because you're a Zionist, a colonizer, an imperialist, and they end up committing the same evil that they claim to be fighting. So anyway, so the whole point is that with the far leftist archetype, you have this shame in the shadow that cannot be resolved. And just like with the far right type, okay, the far right anti-Zionist archetype, you then have dissonance formed between the shadow and the persona once again. Why is that? Because for the far leftist, the persona, the mask that they show to the world is one of justice, is it not? Is it not humanitarianism? Is it not equality? Is it not collectivism? Is it not all of those things? And in fact, an internal or a commitment to anti-isms, non-isms, anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-this, inclusion, all of these things. And so there's a deep dissonance here, just as with religiosity, which requires this sort of moral purity. We're getting the exact same thing on the far left with this persona of moral purity that requires inclusion, love, not othering, not hating people based on their race or ethnicity. So now you have this dissonance between the shadow of the far leftist, which is shame, and the persona of the far leftist, which is humanity. How does the far leftist reconcile the dissonance? The same way that the far rightist reconciled the dissonance, through the mechanism of anti-Zionism as a form of rationalization. So the shadow has all of this shame, has all of this hatred, has all of this bigotry. Because the individual cannot accept that, because it contradicts the persona, they rationalize the shadow. I don't hate Jews. I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just an anti-Zionist. I just believe in humanity and compassion, okay? But we know that this is not an easy rationalization, because you see the behaviors. You see the behaviors of these extremists, which are deeply, deeply hateful. So now we arrive at this place where we have two personalities that are essentially engaged in the same behavior of rationalization for what they're not willing to confront in their shadow. Now we're going to talk about how this leads to anti-Zionism as a collective movement. So at an individual level, these attempts to reconcile the dissonance end up ultimately becoming weak and weakened, because there's this internal war that's constantly ongoing, where the individual says to themselves at a subconscious level, perhaps not at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level, aren't I just being so hateful? Aren't I just being so hateful? I claim that I'm against colonialism and imperialism and all of these things, and that's why I'm, an anti-Zionist. That's why I'm part of this vociferous movement to dismantle a state. No other states in the world, mind you. Don't want to dismantle any other nation, any other state in the world. I simply want to dismantle the Jewish state, which is absolutely necessary for Jewish safety and survival. And we can see that when Jews did not have a homeland, what happened to them? And so their existence, statehood, sovereignty in their ancestral homeland is unquestionable. Any genuinely compassionate individual can understand that. That doesn't mean that they necessarily agree with, military policies of the Israeli government or the current government, but you still would not advocate to dismantle the entire state. You might advocate for a regime change. You might advocate for a change of leadership, of a change of the far right extremists in government, for example, okay? But you do not advocate for the collapse, the dismantling of a state, any state. Fundamentally odd behavior. So this is a person that's saying, it's all just about humanity. I just think that the state of Israel can't exist because of colonialism, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there's this constant remembering. There's this constant subconscious remembering. But I live in the United States of America. This is the biggest, historically, one of the biggest colonial projects in history, right? And I'm not leaving. I'm living on stolen land, and yet I'm saying that I kind of understand why this brutality occurred against people who live on stolen land. And so there's this subconscious awareness that I'm actually justifying hatred against, violence against myself. I'm justifying terrorism against myself by my own logic. So the subconscious cannot lie to itself. There's a constant internal contradiction, constant internal war between I want to believe that I'm an anti-Zionist because I'm a good person, but none of my logic makes sense. So now enter anti-Zionism at a collective level. Anti-Zionism as a collective, as a movement, as a community, provides an opportunity for co-rationalization. So at an individual level, rationalization may be effective up to a certain point, but it is not going to go the entire way unless it's fortified, unless it's substantiated by some mechanism of co-regulation. And that's where anti-Zionism as a collective, as a movement comes in. Because just where you're getting weak, just where that's that part of you that says, maybe I'm really just an asshole, you know, then the movement comes and says, you're not an asshole, you're a good person, you just believe in humanity, which is the lie that the person's telling themselves. Okay, so now you have this co-rationalization effect where each person in this movement is reinforcing the rationalization in each other in order to defeat that dissonance that internally, individually could not be resolved. Okay? So that's how you get to anti-Zionism at a collective level. Now we need to get to understanding how anti-Zionism is today a vehicle for anti-Semitic persecution. So now that you have this in your mind, let's sort of break and go to the concept, understanding the concept of anti-Semitic persecution, which for me, I think is going to be best explained by describing it as five stages of anti-Semitism, and look at it as a clock. Okay, so number one is persecution. Number two is success. Number three is envy. Number four is moral justification. And number five is persecution. So number one and number five are identical. They're both persecution of the Jewish community. So you start with persecution, which has been the story for millennia since the existence of, you know, the Kingdom of Israel. We've seen this long history of colonization, ironically, exile, persecution, slavery, genocide, pogroms, which has just repeated over and over and over and over and over and over again in cycles. So what happens is that the Jewish community have developed a unique epigenetic capacity for resourcefulness, for skillfulness, for excellence, for survival. And this habit, this pattern of perennial anti-Semitism allows for this intermediate explosion of massive success and survival that's happening in between each perennial episode of anti-Semitism, because it just becomes epigenetic at that point. So you have this long history of anti-Semitism, and it starts with persecution because that's just as far back as we can go. And then what happens next is that Jews bounce back, they survive, they become more resourceful, they become more independent, they become more skilled. And then you get to stage three, where society looks on and becomes incredibly envious. And in this state of deep envy, there start to be these justifications to reconcile this envy that you don't want to confront in your shadow, okay? It's just because it's because of nepotism. It's because they control the government. It's because they run Congress. All of these things play into this justification for the envy that society begins to feel every time they see Jews thrive after persecution. So you have stage one, you have persecution, then you have the success, then now we're at stage three, which is the envy, and now come in the moral justification. So if we're talking about, like, let's say the Hitlerian era, for example, okay, you have someone like Hitler, who many historians have frequently described as having this envy towards the Jewish community. And of course, Hitler can't look at his shadow, because Hitler is a quintessential, fragile, malignant narcissist who, if he were to look at his shadow, he would probably correctly identify himself as just inherently evil. So you get Hitler, who's massively envious of the Jewish community and feels this deep sense of inferiority because he's a fragile narcissist. And so in order to reconcile that dissonance that's coming up, okay, so the dissonance is coming back up in his shadow. He knows that he's envious and hateful and bigoted and all of these things, but his persona says, well, I'm not inferior, I'm not jealous, I'm not any of those things. How is he going to reconcile the fact that he, in his shadow, feels deeply inferior? Well, how do you reconcile any feeling? You project the opposite, right? So you feel deeply inferior. What you do in your persona is that you create superiority to deflect from the inferiority that's buried in your shadow. So now you create an entire system rooted in supremacy, racial supremacy. Why does it have to be racial supremacy? Because that is the only thing. You have to find an immutable characteristic to make you superior, because there's nothing that can justify your superiority in the real world, because you suck, right? Hitler sucks. How could he actually justify any form of superiority in the physical world? He can't. So he has to create an inherent superiority. I'm born superior just because I'm German, and you're born inferior just because you're Jewish. Therefore, he's created now a framework that resolves the dissonance in his shadow, which is that he feels inferior. And now he's created an externalized framework that makes him feel superior without actually having to confront and reconcile his shadow. So that becomes the framework. Or the vehicle. This is the vehicle that carries from stage 4 to stage 5, which is persecution. So stage 4 is moral justification. Okay, so now these two things coalesce. And that vehicle, which becomes a moral justification, actually we have to kill Jews because they're impure and we all need to be safe from this impurity, becomes the vehicle that transports from moral justification to stage 5. So once you get to stage 5, which is persecution, we come back to stage 1, which is also persecution once again. Okay, so the clock begins running again. So you have, in Hitler's era, you had persecution from before, 2, success. Okay, so persecution, 1, 2, success, 3, Hitler's envy, 4, moral justification, which is found in this external framework of racial supremacy. And that becomes, they merge, and that becomes the vehicle to go to 5, which is persecution. And that was the genocide committed during the Holocaust. Okay, so now the clock starts running again on Jewish persecution after the Holocaust. So what happens after the Holocaust? The survivors go out into the world, and what do? Stage 2, masses of success, becoming more resilient, more resourceful. These are a community of survivors and builders. And so again, the entire world is looking on, where 5 seconds ago they were in the state of victimization, which was very, very, very comfortable for the anti-Semitic world. If you know anything about being surrounded by envious people, what do you know about that? You know that they're so thrilled when you're suffering, because that is the only time they feel equal or superior to you. All the other times they feel inferior to you, and that is why they're constantly engaged in this subconscious campaign to lower you, if not destroy you entirely. So the clock starts running back to Jewish persecution after the Holocaust. The entire world is deeply comfortable because these massively successful, massively resourceful individuals have been persecuted once again. So now we start to enter stage 2 era. That's the several decades after the Holocaust. So for several decades now you have these survivors that are going out in the world and achieving and succeeding once again, because that is what Jews do. And now you get to stage 3 in society, which is happening a few decades after that. Okay, so you see the time frame. The time frame is always between 2 to 4 decades. That's the estimation for the clock to start running from 1 back to 5 again. Sorry, not decades, generations, which is where we are now. We're approaching that period of time. So now you have the world once again deeply envious. This is a community that was subjected to genocide to the tune of 6 million plus, okay? And they are thriving better than people had no persecution at all. But of course, if you are paying attention, you understand that this is natural. This is of course what they would do, because they're resilient because of the long history of persecution. However, society doesn't understand this and becomes deeply envious once again that the Jewish community is showing unprecedented amounts of growth and survival and resilience. And so the envy begins again. Now we get to stage 3. Society becomes envious once again. Now we are at stage 4. So stage 4 in anti-Semitic persecution is where we are today. This moment in history is stage 4, okay? Now, the envious society deeply seeks to reconcile this dissonance that's come up in their shadow. The ugly in the shadow has come up again. Envy, hatred, bigotry, antipathy, it's there in the shadow, and it seeks a rationalization. It seeks a rationalization, a moral justification for this hatred that it's not willing to confront in its shadow. Now, what it wants to do, okay, so we're at stage 4, what it wants to do at stage 4 is attach again to a framework, to carry it to stage 5 of persecution, but it can't attach to the former framework. The former framework was what? It was fascism. It was racial superiority. Why can't it attach? Because that framework of anti-Semitism has been delegitimized, okay? So gone, disappeared, dispensed with. It cannot attach to that vehicle anymore. So what can it attach to? Okay, so it has to attach to a new framework, a modern framework of anti-Semitic persecution. So the modern framework of anti-Semitic persecution is anti-Zionism, the new rationalization for that hatred and envy in the shadow. So this framework says, I'm not hateful, I'm not envious, I'm not any of these things. I just believe in humanity. And I just think that the Jewish state, not any other state in the world, mind you, only the Jewish state needs to be entirely dismantled and eradicated, okay? But internally, you know what's coming up in your shadow. You know that's just going to breed not just Jewish persecution at the time of the collapse of the state, but thereafter. So this new vehicle transports from stage 4 to stage 5, which is Jewish persecution. That is why now you see people who call themselves anti-Zionists, let's say these, kids on TikTok that are wearing keffiyehs, celebrating October 7th, okay? This is so absurd. But not just that, just the killing of Zionists. So you have people, Jews being killed here in the United States, and they celebrate this. They say this is a good thing in the name of anti-Zionism, right? And you're seeing that this is a completely irreconcilable concept, that you think that it's a good thing to kill people for humanity. It's very Maoist, it's very Leninist, it's very Stalinist. So that is why you're seeing now people celebrating the killing of Jews, and this is just a perennial pattern of anti-Semitic persecution, which, if it's not recognized, I guess gives us not much more time for the wave of persecution to come back round again. And indeed, we are seeing this